Welcome to Strictly Money at the News Forum, where all voices matter. I'm your host, Saijal Patel. Open banking is coming to Canada. Are you ready? Advocates of open banking say it couldn't come fast enough and that customers like you will benefit from improved customer experience and better security. But there's a lot more to consider, and as the saying goes, the devil is in the details. To talk about open banking and what you need to know is Sanjay Pathak. He is partner and national leader of technology strategy and digital transformation services at KPMG Canada. Sanjay, great to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
So for those viewers who are probably not familiar with open banking, can you just explain what it is?
Of course, absolutely. Thank you. Open banking is a concept where the government will enable customers to instruct their incumbent financial services providers to share account and transactional level data with accredited third parties in an open banking ecosystem. And so what that means is this is going to be a method by which we will automate the ability to share banking information, whether it's account information, transactions, et cetera, across the spectrum of accounts and holdings that a consumer might have amongst all of the other accredited parties. There's going to be, sorry, go ahead.
No. That makes sense. I guess my question is why is Canada exploring open banking and what sort of problem do they think that it's going to solve?
I think there's a few perspectives on this, Saijal. One of them is, from a consumer standpoint, I think that what the government is trying to do and what other jurisdictions have been trying to do is increase access to financial services, create more efficiency, manage the risk around how to share information, but then also providing a bit more control for customers on the data that they share out with other institutions. So one of the things that will happen, I think, from a consumer standpoint, is that there will be more choice. There's going to be more choice about how consumers will share their data. And I think there's going to be more choice in the products and services that they have access to. Currently, you create an account with one bank or another bank, et cetera. What open banking will provide is the opportunity to be able to link the information across those different accounts and be able to have better visibility around what you hold, and also potentially choose better products from an institutional. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, Sanjay, I was going to say, you mentioned about how information is being shared. What's happening right now? And because one of the biggest concerns for people is the security risk.
It's a great question. Open banking as a concept is it's not new. There are a lot of different products and services out there. Many people have apps, applications and programs, financial management programs, et cetera, that already aggregate and organize financial data. What's happening today, though, is you're either feeding those programs with spreadsheets that you're downloading from your bank, or in some cases, it's a method called screen scraping. And I'm not sure how many people really truly understand what screen scraping is, but what, in quick terms, what it is consumers are being asked to provide their usernames and passwords to these programs that aggregate their financial information. And then that application program is actually going in behind the scenes, logging into their accounts, and then scraping the data from the relevant pages in order to aggregate them into the programs. Now, we've been hearing for years, don't share your passwords, don't share your PINs, keep your personal information safe. And yet, to date, this is the best that most of these programs can do about aggregating financial information. And it's not great. It really leaves not only consumers exposed, they should hate this for obvious reasons, but businesses are taking on huge liability with holding this information, usernames, passwords, et cetera. So it's a suboptimal practice, and it drives, it can drive super risky outcomes and behaviors.
Yeah, so you can understand why this would solve the security problem. Sanjay, we only have about 40 seconds to the commercial break. Are there certain members or organizations in the industry that are more behind this than others? Who's likely to benefit?
I think the banks are seeing this as an opportunity. It's a big challenge for them. It's a big cost and it's a big lift. They're having to create the automation behind the scenes in order to share the data. I think there's going to be a lot of fintechs that are going to come into play, and they're going to start to innovate around the data that they expect that they would have. And consumers are going to benefit ultimately by improved choice, improved access, and a lot better visibility across the different banking products they own. I think one of the things that's going to have to happen is that uplift in education and understanding of what open banking is, what the risks are, what the opportunities are. And really, open banking success will be driven by how many people really participate.
Welcome back. Sanjay, can we run through an example so viewers understand how this could work? Suppose I have a bank account at BMO and I have insurance with Desjardins and I have an advisor who's at an independent wealth company. For example, what would BMO do to help me support my goals?
It's a great question. And maybe I might take a step back, if you don't mind. And I'll explain a bit about how the network is going to work and then how everyone will participate. So let's start with creating the network. The government has really taken on the mandate to assign an open banking leader who's creating all of the policies, regulations, guidelines, et cetera, to drive this. Who can participate? How much will the participants be able to do? And how is everyone going to communicate? So once that network is established, everyone is going to have to find a common way to manage consent and permission and data sharing with consumers. So when I started diving into this topic, it was a bit surprising how much more complicated this is under the surface, but it's so much more critical that, we find ways to manage those permissions and manage the consent, because as I said before, participation matters. So let's talk about your example. Let's say I subscribe to a fintech app called ABC, or in your case here, the example, BMO provides me a service called ABC, which promises to aggregate my data. When I sign up with them, I need to tell them which accounts I want to have included in the network. And then I'm going to have to be able to have a mechanism to choose which accounts, what information, how much of that information I want to share with BMO, with this ABC app. And then it's up to the application and ultimately BMO to manage that information, keep it secure, and only show me what I'm allowed or what I've authorized to show. So these opt-in, opt-out decisions have to be logged securely with the providers. And I need to make sure that there's a way that I can hold them to account. Now, what's really going to happen there is you ultimately end up with this aggregated view of your financials for all the things that you've opted in for. But now imagine BMO has all this information, and they should be able to take that and understand what you need and what you might want. And so for them, there might be a way for them to target, you with better products, better services based on your profile, based on the attributes you provided. So for customers with your profile, let's offer you a GIC with these terms, et cetera. And this is where I think competition is going to heat up across the institutions.
So I'm going to play the skeptic hat here, Sanjay, because so many consumers are skeptical of the financial industry, and they don't believe that they're going to have their best interest at heart. So what do they need to know? How do they sort of protect themselves?
Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to tell my family when this becomes more mainstream thing. First and foremost, get educated. I think that we in the industry talk a lot about things like products and services, et cetera, which might seem a bit hard to grasp. A product is really like an account or like a GIC or a mutual fund or something. So the first and foremost of all these things is understand what you have in your ecosystem. Understand where are all of your accounts and products. And then the second is decide for yourself what you want to do, what you want to opt in for, where you want to give permission and consent. And you don't have to give everything. And I think that the government will have to do a very good job. And I'm very confident that they will do this. They're going to have to provide these mechanisms for people to opt in confidently and opt out confidently and easily. And so I think that part of how this is going to work, the specifics, this is what the government is working on right now. Abraham and team are working hard on this right now with public consultations. But ultimately, the biggest piece of advice I'd give is get educated about what the products and services are and be very confident and deliberate and intentional about what you want, where you want to give permission and access to the data you're given.
Is privacy at all an issue? I mean, it's an issue for people. So for those who are worried about sort of privacy concerns, is there anything that they need to know?
Yes, absolutely. I think privacy is going to be a very big part of this, primarily because we're talking about very intimate details, personal information banking information, financial information. And so part of it, what we call the accreditation process and what other jurisdictions have been looking at very, very closely is how do you keep that data safe? How do you make sure that personal information is treated in line with federal and global regulations? And so that's going to be a big part of where the government will have to step in and not only define what those regulations, policies, and procedures are, but enforce them very, very, very closely. And I think for all participating members, whether they're banks or fintechs or whomever, they're going to be held to a very, very high standard because we're now opening up the playing field so that this information is going to be shared amongst each other. It's quite a big deal. Of course, privacy is going to be a big deal.
Okay, we'll continue this conversation. Still a lot more to talk about. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Strictly Money. Our guest this show is Sanjay Pathak, and we've been talking about open banking, the merits and the risks. Sanjay, I want to circle back to why Canada is doing this. And are there other countries that we are modeling our framework after, or at the very least, I guess, learning from their mistakes?
It's a great question. There are very few countries that have mandated this top-down from a public policy and regulation standpoint. Australia and UK are probably the two largest jurisdictions that have actually done something with this. UK was first, and Australia was next. And I was living in Australia actually while open banking was being rolled out.
Okay.
The top-down view of open banking is that it really leads from a place of what people are calling consumer data rights. And open banking is a first step in what is typically or somewhat sometimes called open data, the journey to open data in evolution of where we're trying to open up the freedom to share and collaborate with data. And so what Australia has done in particular, I know a fair amount of this firsthand. What Australia has done is they started with banking as an industry where their mandate is really to have consumers control the data, control their data, and have much more ability to manage what is shared and what is not shared. And what's next off the rank for them, next cab off the rank for them is going to be energy. So they're going to start looking at doing a similar type of thing for energy that they're doing for open banking. Other jurisdictions like Singapore are taking a bit more of a market-driven approach. So there's no official mandate, but the regulators are extremely focused around how to support and drive more open banking and innovation in the ecosystem. Things like digital identity, automating data sharing through things called APIs, et cetera. And so what's happening here, I think Canada can learn from both, right? And I think that what Abraham touched on, who's the leader for open banking Canada, he's a really unique background. He's played in, he's worked in public and private sector, and he's lived in Asia Pacific for a while. He's in Canada now. And I think his perspective to be able to work across the different models is going to be critical here. So I think that there's a lot to learn from the Australia, from the UK experience, but also from the standpoint of innovation and I would say financial inclusion as well, Singapore and Asia Pacific.
Yeah, I want to touch on that as well. Going back though, like anything, execution is key. And you had alluded to this, Sanjay, that there's a lot of complexities to this. My understanding was that the goal of open banking, or to have it here, was like January, and we're past that. So what's been the holdup? Like what are the sticking points that they're working through right now? And when are we going to see it?
Well, I think there's set to be some action and delivery in the middle to late part of this year, and I won't go into the dates because they do shift a bit, and I want to give the government the ability to sort of flex on doing the right thing. Yes, they were supposed to have started deploying things earlier this year. I think this is a very, very complex issue to solve, and I did touch on it before. The policies and guidelines, the intent, at the highest level is probably fairly easy to grasp. However, the details on how these things are going to actually work, the detailed policies on guidelines, things like keeping our data safe and making sure that accredited and participating institutions follow those guidelines and creating ways to monitor and assure that they're following the guidelines and that the data is safe. Those are all things that are going to take time. So in fact, the first release and first rollout of open banking is going to be what's called read only. So it will be about publishing information, but not consuming that information. And I kind of see that as a soft launch of how this is going to go. So the execution, if it is delayed, it's because this is extraordinarily complex. In addition to complying with the government's policies, guidelines, and procedures, many of the banks, and I do work with a lot of the banks very, very closely. I know from a back end perspective on their infrastructure is extremely complicated to make some of these changes, especially around things like consent and permissions, because previously they didn't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
So bolting those capabilities on is actually quite complicated.
Okay. We only have 40 seconds to the next commercial break, but you just hit on something, the financial burden on this for the industry. Is it going to just get passed on to consumers, or could we actually see some cost savings?
I personally think it's going to create more competition, and with more competition, you tend to see costs come down. I think what's going to happen for consumers is, one, lots more choice. For those who participate and choose to share their data, I think they'll have access to much more choice, probably more financial incentive to participate in programs or buy products they previously didn't have before. So I do think that more choice, costs coming down is going to be the reality. However, that's, we have to see how things play out, because this is a pretty substantial investment that the banks and the government is making.
Okay. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Sanjay, you've talked a little bit about competition. I do want to talk about that as well, but I just want to talk about the innovation piece. Because Singapore is doing a lot around this. What sort of innovation could you see coming out of this? Because I can only imagine that this is just the start of new services and offerings.
I think innovation is going to be a huge component of this. When you look at what Singapore has done in terms of creating the platform for things like digital identity, and these things called APIs, which are application programming interfaces, which are the ways that banks and others who participate will communicate with each other in an automated way. These are all things that have existed, and the demand for them has been quite high. But I think what's going to happen is this is going to accelerate. Once people start to see the economic opportunity, and once the government starts to really lean into the public enablement opportunity, the inclusion opportunity, you're going to start to see a lot of these things become much more mainstream and much more adopted. Many of the big technology companies have already gone there in terms of their ability to do these things. What they have not necessarily had is the regulatory permission to play and the ability to go after it. And that's why the top-down, the regulatory-driven open banking mandates are just so important, because those are the mandates that create the room for the innovation to start. You look at a place like Singapore, they're going to innovate anyway. And arguably, Singapore is a bit more of a bounded economy in terms of their ability to do things. It's a little bit more, you can kind of reach the edges of that economy. You can play with it. So I do think that there's going to be quite a bit more innovation to come, and it's going to be on the back of seizing the opportunity that's been opened up.
Do you think, though, it will improve competition? I know you touched on it, but we got the big players here. We got the big banks. So I'm just wondering, is it just going to provide more consolidation of power for them? Or, are we going to see the smaller players like the fintechs rise up?
The government's been very consistent in saying that there's a lot of room here for fintechs to play. And indeed, when you go to the when I've been to the conferences and the demos, et cetera, and there are a lot of fintechs who are looking for ways to innovate. What they need is the data. What they need is the permission. They need the information to play. So I'm not sure that, I think the banks are going to benefit from this, just in terms of their ability to see across their customers' portfolios and what they have. But I also think that there's a big opportunity for fintechs that are willing to invest, and actually big tech as well, who are willing to invest and understand a bit more about how they can create economic opportunity here. The other part of this, I think, is going to be, when we talk about innovation, that there's a notion of this S curve, which is, things sort of move at a slower pace, but there's this catalytic event. There's this catalyst that brings you straight up, and then things really, really accelerate. And I think open banking might be one of those catalysts to start driving consumer-focused financial services innovation through open banking. Now, I think we need more we need more participants to be on the rails, and that's where the permission, security, privacy, all of those things we talked about before are going to be so important.
Yeah.
But I do see this as a catalyst for innovation for sure.
Sanjay, we're almost at the end of the show. We have a minute left. One of the things I love about competition in fintech is it gives access to people who normally wouldn't have access to the industry, right? Like not everyone can access a financial advisor because they don't have the wealth. Do you have any insight into what that could mean?
There's still a significant portion of Canada that is underbanked or unbanked, and those are terms that that people tend to use. I think what this creates is a lot more ability for financial inclusion, and not just for people to participate who hadn't been participating, but actually allowing more Canadians to participate more fully with more complex banking products that they may not have had access to, they may not have known about. And so I think there's a huge opportunity there. And this goes back to one of the things I'd said before, which is that education piece, knowing what you have in your portfolio, understanding your needs. And then when you participate, there's an opportunity for the banks, for fintechs, for others to educate the public.
Yeah.
And I hope that the government really seizes that.
Yeah, well, that's why we do this show, Sanjay, to try to educate Canadians. We really appreciate you coming on today. Thanks so much for your insights.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Sanjay Pathak of KPMG Canada. Well, we've come to the end of this show. How do you feel about open banking? Would you welcome it or do you have some concerns? Drop me an email and let me know because I'd love to hear from you. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.